Hello and welcome to Law and Candor, the podcast wholly devoted to pursuing the legal technology revolution. I'm Rob, and I'm here with my co-host Bill. And our topic today is the truth behind data reuse. Our guest on today's episode is Erika Namnath, Executive Director of Advisory Services at Lighthouse. But before we talk to Erika, we first want to bring you
Sightings of Radical Brilliance.
If you remember, this is the part of the show where we talk about some of the latest technology trends or anything noteworthy that's caught our eye in the last week or so.
Yeah, and this week we have a really, really cool company to sort of profile and a really cool concept. The company is Big Moon Power, and these guys harness the power of the moon, via the ocean tide to generate energy.
Yeah, this is crazy. I mean, using tidal power is not really a new concept. A lot of companies have tried it. I think what makes Big Moon different is that those other companies have tried it, just haven't been able to get it to work at any scale, at any efficiency. The typical design for this is a turbine that you actually attach to the bottom of the ocean and, of course, use the tidal to turn the turbine. But it turns out that first of all, it's really hard to attach things to the bottom of the ocean. And once you do, they corrode and they're really hard to service. And so these guys are taking just a completely different approach to this.
Yeah, they're up in the Bay of Fundy, which apparently has more water coming in and out of it than all the rivers in the world. And I think every tidal company that's ever tried to do this is all set up shop up there in Nova Scotia. And yeah, it's just incredible stuff. I mean, I was reading about it earlier today, and the chairman, the founder, is Lynn Blodgett, and Andy Jenkins is the CEO, and they're both of ACS and Xerox fame. So they obviously know how to run a company. Just impressive guys, impressive story, really cool concept for a technology. Check it out if you get a chance. It's called Big Moon Power and Tidal Energy. Very cool.
Yeah, we'll keep our eye on these guys and see how it turns out. But for now, let's turn to our guest speaker. We're here to talk about data reuse and how data repositories can be set up to not just reuse data on future matters, but maybe even used in other ways to help save money, reduce project costs. And we're really happy to have Erika here today. Erika, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. But why don't you start and just introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I'm a somewhat recent addition to the Lighthouse family. I've been here a little over 6 months now, but I've been working in the industry for over 14 years. And that sounds like a pretty long time. It feels like a pretty long time to me sometimes. But fortunately for me, it's definitely never been boring. I've gotten to do all kinds of different things, everything from building search queries and advising on the use of analytics to just overall project management. And over the years, I've gotten to touch just about every stage of the e-discovery lifecycle: data processing, hosting, review, production, all the fun stuff. Now my team and I are focused on helping our clients enable e-discovery capabilities on their own systems so that they can keep all or part of the process in-house if they'd like to do that.
We've talked on the show about things with Microsoft 365. We have an upcoming podcast on that as well. So that's going to become a more and more prevalent in the industry. Data reuse seems to be something almost like analytics, right? It means something different to everybody. Some people think of it very narrowly, right? Just reusing work product. So can we talk about just the concept of data reuse and how you see it?
Definitely. You're absolutely right that there's a lot of different ways that folks think about it, a lot of different things that come to mind for different people. But for me, the foundation of all of it is actually the data itself, meaning the underlying ESI. So work product definitely comes into play, but I think from the get-go, you need to be thinking about, do I really want to go back and recollect the same files over and over again? Do I really want to go back and re-index the same data? It definitely makes much more sense to try to utilize what you already have rather than starting from scratch every single time.
Erika, do you think it's fair that probably most corporations would be pretty surprised if they had a way to kind of easily see how much duplicative data that they've collected and then sent out for processing and review?
Yeah, I definitely would. I think everybody sort of has a sense that there is some stuff that they're doing multiple times, but I don't think they really understand the true gravity or amount of it. I think a lot of folks would be surprised that it's probably, it's not just like, say, 10% or 20%. It can be quite a bit more, especially if you have the same custodians in play all the time and you're looking at kind of like everything from X date forward. That's going to be a lot of the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So let's start to dive into some specific areas of data reuse. So, for instance, IP and trade secrets. How would you how would you reuse data when you're tackling something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people, when they think about work product and reuse, they're a little bit concerned about the fact that subject matter changes from matter to matter, right? And it's not necessarily the case that you're looking for the same thing every time, but there's actually quite a few components of many reviews that are actually static and stay the same no matter what you're doing. So, like you said, IP, trade secret, those are things that you have to go in and take a look at and redact, every single time. There's other things like personally identifying information, personal health information. All of these things, they don't change based on subject matter, right? They're always something to deal with. Priv, for example, also, I mean, privilege is a big time suck, right? You go through and you have to do all the coding. You have to make the priv log, everything else. Like that takes a lot of time and it can be really expensive. And so if you're not leveraging what you've done in the past, you're really kind of doing yourself a disservice, I think.
I think, this is something we've talked about before where, if you're a typical corporation and you've got a real heavy regulatory and litigation profile, and if you've been doing this, if you've been kind of doing e-discovery for the last 15 or 20 years, I think part of the problem is that you have all these databases that are sitting with, different providers and different law firms, and maybe you've got some of them internally, and then on top of that, they're on different platforms. Do you think that's the main reason why people haven't been doing this more, or like what are some of the limitations you think that companies face?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's part of it. It is a challenge, right? If you're trying to consolidate databases, especially if they're across different vendors, it's difficult to say, not difficult, but not necessarily entirely straightforward to go through and single instance everything, because obviously regular files like not non-email files, Excel's, Word, that kind of stuff, all of that is usually deduped based on the binary information. So that's going to be constant, no matter which vendor you're using. But email data often has a slightly different recipe depending on who you're working with. And so deduping that just based on existing MD5 hashes, for example, can be difficult. And so it's basically, you have to decide, like, are you going to just do kind of a from now forward approach? Do you want to consolidate all those things and deduplicate to the extent that you can? Do you want to consider just reprocessing everything so that it's consistent and then you have like a nice fresh start? There's a lot of different ways to tackle that. But yeah, I do think that can kind of feel overwhelming sometimes. But, if you have a good plan and you talk through everything and you kind of outline all the steps that are necessary and kind of, weigh the pros and cons of different approaches, like I think most people can then get to a point where they feel good about that process and are excited about going forward with it because of all the benefits that come with it down the road.
Yeah, Rob and I have talked about this quite a bit, and want to get your opinion on this. Not just reusing the work product in the data as is, as in this was privilege, this was responsive, this was non-responsive. Because again, other than privilege, that might responsive, non-responsive might change depending on the case. It's interesting when a document is tagged as non-responsive, that you not only just reuse that work product as non-responsive, but you could also, what about that document made it non-responsive? Is it just objectively non-responsive, similar to priv? What about that document made it priv? You might not see a duplicate of that document to reuse it as priv later, but you might see the same components that existed in that document that made it priv in another document. Again, not a duplicate, but it was sent from this person to that person with less than a certain amount of people on it discussing a certain topic. Talk about the components of not just the work product itself, but the data behind the work product.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different things that can be leveraged there. So I think with respect to, say, privilege, like you were saying, especially if it's content-based privilege, not so much about like the recipients and such, that's definitely something that you can utilize supervised learning for, to say, take what you've already coded as priv based on content and actually try to see if there's anything that also is kind of shares those same types of characteristics from a analytics standpoint in your new data. And that can, and maybe that's not the end all be all priv call for you, but it at least can kind of get you a head start, right? There's also, just generally speaking, things like, the very technical term of junk files all the time. And, those things don't really change from matter to matter either. Your email blasts and things like that are obviously never going to be responsive kind of no matter what happens. Like you definitely want to leverage that type of information over and over again. So this is things that, like, looking at the sending entities, the recipients, like, is this a huge distribution list, for example? If that's the case, and this probably isn't, at issue here. And then separate from that, you can definitely also take a look at things like clustering for the same type of thing. Like it can give you clues into what pockets of data just don't make sense to even consider, or what pockets of data are particularly interesting or definitely need to be looked at first. And that can apply to in any of these things. You can definitely use it for priv. You can certainly use it for trade secret and IP discussions. Like there's a lot of different ways to leverage what you know now for new data, and not necessarily relying on the exact files being the same.
Yeah, it seems it's interesting, like if you could kind of picture this in its perfect state, imagine if you're starting a document review and you already have a good idea about the history of a lot of these documents. And I'm looking at an email and I can see that it was produced in other cases. It was, responsive in this type of a case and not responsive in this. It just seems like that's a much better way to review than reinventing the wheel every single time with every review, with brand new data.
Absolutely. And tracking all of that information, it can sound a little bit daunting at first, but there's so much that you can get out of it. So definitely tracking things like from matter to matter, what's responsive versus not. I mean, you never know when you're going to see another matter that's extremely similar, or at least partially similar to what you've done before. And you definitely want to leverage that, right? I mean, every time litigation comes up, there's always that time pressure. There's always that everything needs to happen yesterday. So anything you can do to kind of jump ahead is going to be a huge benefit to you, and that in terms of cost, in terms of time, in terms of just general efficiency, and then also consistency, right? Like you don't want to be making different priv calls from matter to matter just because different people are looking at the documents, right? So the more that you can be consistent, the better off you're going to be, the safer it is for your company. There's nothing but good things that come from it.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me how clients of ours will underestimate how much overlap exists in a case, whether it be data, custodians, or concepts. Whether it's a big pharma company fighting the same IP litigation on a certain drug, or even when a big company who's in a growth by acquisition mode acquires other companies. A lot of the same data, a lot of the same concepts are at issue. And it's amazing to me how they always underestimate that. Don't think it's going to be as big a deal, but when you can show them the ROI on reusing data, that's when they perk up.
Definitely, that time and dollar savings definitely speaks to everyone. And I have to say, I would love to challenge just about anybody out there in terms of like, if they wanted to say, no, I can't imagine saving money with this, with these efforts. Like I just can't imagine that would ever actually be true. Of course, I could be proven wrong, but I would be very surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with something you said earlier that, I think sometimes people automatically default to responsiveness. And yeah, that's what a lot of review is about. But when it comes to non-responsive, I know that in the research that we're doing is that, we're sort of discovering this whole class of, what we call objectively not responsive data. And it's like you said, it's, these are documents that get pulled in by keywords. They could never be responsive. They've probably been tagged not responsive in many cases before. And if you had that data, you could sort of figure that out at the beginning and maybe say, hey, here's a section of this data that, we're not going to linearly review. Maybe we're going to sample it. There's probably all sorts of options for that.
Yeah, definitely. The sampling is a really good point, because obviously folks want to feel comfortable with the approach, right? And being totally sight unseen on things obviously makes folks a little nervous, and that's completely understandable. And that's where sampling comes into play, right? If you have this whole population of data that you're pretty certain just makes no sense to even take a look at, that's great. But then take some portion of it and kind of whip through it real quick just to verify. And then if there are any sort of prevalent patterns in there that actually do need to be reviewed, you're going to see that fairly quickly, and then you can adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that we're going to see use of this more, and especially as, technology options, that make this possible increase. This has been a great discussion, Erika, and we want to thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, no problem. Honestly, I could talk about this all day, every day.
Well, you might have to, because we have so many fans of this podcast that you might get accosted on the street and they might want to talk to you about this. Is it just a heads up that your privacy has officially gone away now?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the warning.
Yeah, practice disguising your voice. That's really going to be the key giveaway.
Wear sunglasses, maybe like a shaded cap or something, carry an umbrella, things like that.
Okay, I'll adopt a new accent too.
Perfect.
Well, maybe just to sum things up, we called this, the truth about data reuse, and I think what the truth is that there's definitely a lot of potential in this technology. We have this data; it's sitting in databases. It can be aggregated, it can be studied, and when you're talking about, maybe less of a focus on responsiveness, but for things that are non-responsive, for privilege, for PII and PHI. these are really things that are becoming more important, and I think there's a great use case for.
Yep, absolutely.
So, all right, listen, thanks everybody for tuning in. Next time we will be talking about a really interesting topic. This is the Microsoft 365 part 1 of a 2-part series there. And it's going to be about the influence Microsoft is having on the next evolution of e-discovery. So tune into us then. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. Appreciate it.